Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening. Pooh Bear.
Pooh Bear likes being in the dark.
Some young guy, Pooh Bear. Are you trying to tell us something?
I'm like messing with Pooh Bear in the background. I keep muting his mic and unmuting his mic. So, did you need help? There he is.
Let me come back in.
Okay. Well, great way to start our show. Somebody left dirty. Only in the community hall.
Two Pump Chump.
Yeah, 2 Pump Chump.
Watch that be his name on the next tournament he fishes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Topic of tonight, for everybody that was aware, is just going to be jigs. Everything from head design to banded or tied, wire tied, floss tied, hooks to skirt material to hook size, 2X, 3X hooks, 4X hooks, whatever you want to call it. Even the angle of your line tie and also the orientation of your line tie. And by orientation, I mean sometimes your hook eye is horizontal or sometimes it's vertical. So the actual hook itself, where you tie your line, is either vertical or it's horizontal. So just from my experience, these guys are going to give me some tips as well too, hopefully. Just where I found, because I used to make jigs for myself because I couldn't afford to buy a jig for $5, when I started bass fishing. So Pooh Bear's having issues.
He's got his hand too far in the honey pot.
We got you, Pooh Bear. We don't hear you, but we got you, Pooh Bear. Technical difficulties. Where do we start, Joseph? I'll let you take at it. Since
I don't know. I'm like the least jiggy of the folk here, but
well, we'll start with your confidence jig. What is your confidence jig?
It's a cheater jig, so I mean, everybody's confidence jig is probably my confidence jig, but I have a tremendous soft spot for the Keitech M2 football jig. I think that's, if I were to try to teach somebody how to jig fish and I wanted them to have fun and actually catch fish, that would be the first thing that I would pick up in California specifically, just because majority of the lakes that we have are, fairly open, rocky bottom lakes, like all of our motherlode lakes, Folsom, Berryessa, just all those areas tend to really, really shine for a football jig. So that's what I fish the majority of the time. I have probably 15 different types of football jigs that I like to fish a lot, but I would definitely say the Keitech is my favorite. And one of my favorite engineering terms that I like to apply to fishing too is keep it simple, stupid. And I really don't complicate it. I fish 2 trailers pretty much exclusively. If I were to buy one jig to fish pretty much exclusively throughout the year, it would be this one, and I would have 2 trailers. I would have the Gary Yamamoto Twin Tail in a 5-inch, and I would have a Gary Yamamoto Flapping Hog in the 3.75-inch. And basically what that allows you to do is take a relatively small compact jig like this and fish it as a compact jig with that twin tail, and also fish it more as a full profile jig with the Flapping Hog. And I would say probably 85 to 90% of the time I jig fish, I pick up a jig just like this one, or I actually have a guy that makes custom jigs. I got a bunch of his stuff here that prototyping, but it's basically the same size, just different hook and then lead, obviously. But there is really something to the tungsten on rock. I really find that to make a different sound, a different pitch. I don't know what it is, but when tungsten knocks into rock, you feel it. Obviously, it's much more of a hard tinging sensation in the rod versus lead being a little bit more of a dull thud.
So
Yeah, that's definitely my first choice if I'm going to pick up a jig.
So I got a question for you, Joseph. When you throw a Kitech jig, have you ever considered why the line tie is so high up in the jig head? As in,
I
it's
have,
technically.
and I do know, and it's so that as it's crawling up and over rocks, the line that would normally be dragged over rocks is oriented up so that it doesn't smash into the rock and cut it up. And vertical versus horizontal in football jigs, I haven't found that it matters as much, but in other jig types, I've noticed that, when the horizontal line tie, which is basically if you were to take the line tie that you see on the screen and rotate it 90 degrees, really, really helps when you're fishing structure. So like brush or grass or things like that, it helps to climb up and over rather than plow your line through and get tangled up.
So one of the fun facts about jig fishing that I figured is once you have that line tie at 0 degrees, they technically call this they call this a 90-degree line tie, where the hook tying point is straight up in the lead or in the jig head in general is considered your 90-degree line tie, or straight vertical. What happens is when you drag it, it causes the trailer to stand up more. So essentially you get it to stand up more versus as if you had the line tie straight, where it's straight with the jig head, just like say, it's easier if I show you guys, like say a swim jig, where the swim jig is, a swim jig is more straight, more in line with the hook eye or the hook point. Then as you drag that jig, the jig doesn't really stand up. So, that's one of the reasons why the hook tie point is so straight up and vertical in the jig head for football jigs. Yeah,
it's so that when you apply pressure to the bait, it wants to roll up and come up over structure instead of plow into structure, which is why it's something I would pick for California as like my go-to jig. Now I have a couple others. You mentioned stand-up. I know they make some in various capacities of a football jig. Yes. The one that I really like is actually made by Do It Molds. So that's one that you'd have to find somebody that makes jigs or buy the mold yourself. But it actually has an interesting feature. It'd be better to just go grab one and show you. It's still a 90-degree vertical line tie, but it's actually recessed.
It has like a cup.
Yeah, you want to explain why you would want to recess 90 while I go grab my jig box? If I can show you them.
A quick one would be a recessed line tie would be like a Bass Patrol. A Bass Patrol has a recessed line tie, or say a Dirty Jigs finesse jig also has a recessed line tie. And the biggest thing about recessed line tie that I have found personally is it comes to cover easier, in my opinion. Where's their Dirty Jigs finesse jig? There it is. So this is just basically a horizontal line tie that's recessed versus a Bass Patrol where it is vertical. The line tie is vertical, but it's technically recessed into the lead head.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I've just found that it comes through grass, not grass, but wood better, like your limbs. Because what happens as you're pulling it, if there's the hook eye is still left sticking out as you pull it, is the knot and the jig itself will kind of fold over on itself on the limb. So sometimes it'll end up catching on itself. Versus as if you had a recessed line tie, your knot is going to slide on the limb and then it's just going to kind of like fall right over. Versus where if it's on, it gives like a breaking point. So your jig is going to hang more on it versus as if you pull it, the knot is just going to slip and it just kind of like drop right over. Go ahead, Joseph. Since you're back, I'll give you the
Yeah, I
solo
mean,
layout.
I brought them, and I shouldn't be sharing my juice, but that's it. As you can tell by the head, probably not so well in the lighting that I have. These have been abused. I think more commonly you can see that the hook is like damn near straightened out at this point. But yeah, that's my go-to color right there. I keep it pretty simple: green pumpkin black, green pumpkin trailers. And the reason I like this specifically is because I did some homework today and I went and looked at some craws at Tulloch and took some pictures. Maybe I'll have Max throw one up to show you. But I like my neutral colors, and again, this football jig specifically because it's not just crawdads, right? When we talk about jigs, almost everyone thinks that you're just going to imitate crawdads, but time and time again, I can tell you that this represents bluegill just as well as crayfish, just as well as shad or any other type of forage. But again, that neutral green pumpkin with a little bit of black makes that stand out. And if you want more color, there's Spike It products to change the color of your trailer. The other football that I really like, again, I tell you, recessed line tie, and it's actually a stand-up football jig. So what it is that head is flat. And this one, I especially, Max was talking around wood and stuff. If any of you remember Maloney's, when it was really low, there were roots like everywhere. Everywhere, trees sticking up. I don't know. Did you guys get to come up and fish for that, Max? I don't know if you were here when Maloney's was down like 150 feet, but you remember that, Pua, when
Yep.
When we went out there for that, there were treetops everywhere, roots everywhere. And if you were to pick up something like that Kitech jig or really any other jig that didn't have a flat-ish bottom, you would find every root every single time. And it would be a miserable experience to drag anything that wasn't like a Texas rig. But yeah, again, when I talk about full size versus a compact jig, you can clearly see just the size difference here in the profile of this jig. I mean, it's almost double the size of it. So again, I don't fish a full size jig as much as I should. That's more of a Pua and Max thing. But that would be my go-to. And then again, just a quick example, we keep talking about vertical and horizontal line ties. This would be an example of a horizontal line tie versus a vertical line tie, if you can see them.
Your camera's to your left more, sir.
There we go. Better. Sorry.
Perfect.
Can't see it from the black bar of things. There's just like a white light.
Yeah.
All right.
No,
what about you? What would be your go-to jig if you had one you had to pick?
Send it.
Are you guys talking? Oh, you guys are talking to me. Sorry, I had a little beep in my earbuds. So me personally, I like to use Arky style. I exclusively use the TNT jigs and the Buckeye mop jigs. I like using the Arky style because sometimes I like to swim them. Kind of like a swim jig. So, and I keep it real standard: green pumpkin, black and blue. Like Tax was saying earlier, you're imitating a lot more things than just a crawdad. You got to remember the gobies, the sculpins, and all those creatures that dwell on the bottom, besides the crawdads. But yeah, the Arky style heads for me specifically because sometimes I'm dragging, other times I'm swimming it. And when I'm talking about swimming a jig, I'm not talking about swimming it like that. I'm talking about you're slowly swimming it over the crevices of rocks and the ground, the dirt. And you're just, yeah, there you go. And you're just kind of maintaining contact of the ground as with the bottom as you're swimming it back to you. And sometimes that'll trigger bites. Sometimes that'll get them to chase your bait, and then when you kill it, you notice that your line's drifting somewhere else, and that's when they've already taken it. But in the wintertime, I still fish a very big profile, believe it or not. But everything I just said, I do it even slower. So swimming the jig, I swim it really, really, really dead slow. But I like these these vertical ties, these horizontal ties versus the other ties, because it kind of, I mean, it lets the line swivel around too, but I don't know, it's just something I'm used to. I don't want to say it's one's better than the other, but for me, it's you're able to kind of just throw it anywhere pretty much, just not in a whole bunch of like trees and get hung up. But yeah, I mean, I keep it real simple with the jigs. I'm not really per se a jig guy, but I mean, I will throw it when I feel like I need to, when I need to drag bottom or fish it closer to the bottom. But yep, that's me.
Well, I guess I'll take a crack.
Actually,
Go ahead.
Actually, let me include that on the Delta. I do throw a jig too. But it's more of a pre-spawn, a spawn time for me that I will throw a jig. After that, I don't throw it anymore. It's I'm chucking and winding, but black and red. Go ahead.
Why a jig versus, say, just like a punch rig? Just because you could kind of get it, you kind of get it kind of the same. Why?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Punch rig?
For sure.
Yeah.
So during that spawn time, right? You still got the grass kind of coming back to life. I mean, there'll always be grass on the Delta, but
yeah,
you still got some areas you're gonna get grass just starting to come out, and it's very sparse, right? That's where the jig shines on the Delta, in my opinion, because if you're gonna throw a punch rig instead, I mean, you don't really need to throw it into that much space. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's too sparse for you to be punching.
Mm-hmm.
You could definitely flip. You could definitely flip a lighter weight into that stuff. But I think a jig just has that natural fall versus your like, let's say, half ounce to like a quarter ounce punch flipping weight.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be more natural presentation for the fish.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna continue though. You were saying black and red.
Oh yeah, black and red. Yeah, that's what I throw during the springtime. The pre-spawn to spawn time. I mean, that's what I throw exclusively.
I literally only own this jig for the Delta, but again, he's talking that Arky style. This is, again, not quite something you can go out and buy, although I think some people maybe make it. Again, made by Do It Molds. This is the brush head. So it's actually conical. If I come back over here and show you, it comes to a point. It's got a recessed line tie and a flat head, so it does like to stand up. But when you're talking about the Delta and jig fishing, I really like flipping that into toolies or swimming it around toolies or dragging it over rock. And it really helps to go give this little tidbit of juice to have a flat trailer. Not a round trailer, not any other style of trailer, but something that has a very flat bottom when you're fishing the Delta, unless you want to get snagged on God knows what is on the bottom. That's something I've learned the very hard way, fishing things like twin tails and grubs and stuff. You'll not survive, at least not very long, with that jig. So if you want to donate, by all means, go for it.
There you go, Joseph. The only problem is it is not your Delta Reds, but they do make it. in the brush style head. There you go, sir. But just not your Delta Reds.
Gotcha. Well, and that's a punching jig.
Yeah, but you could technically use it for the same application.
Yeah. I mean, the only difference is this is only a quarter ounce, right? And I like that. I kind of alternate on the Delta. I either fish 3/8 or I fish a quarter, but more often than not, I fish a quarter just because I don't want that jig to get buried into that like
grass.
angel hair snot moss that was super, super prevalent there in the wintertime.
Yep.
Before we move on, Sean wants a Sonder crest from you, boy.
Yeah, you started it. Little cutie and Toolie.
Oh, dear. That was a great
Next time.
All right. Well, time to dive in. This is probably going to be the most hairiest part of the entire thing. Where to start? All right. I'll just share this screen because this is the jig that I fish 95% of the time. And the other 5% of the time, I'm fishing some sort of finesse jig. So I start here. This is my baseline. There's a ton of jigs on the market. There's jigs, custom jigs, Tasmo jigs, Bastion jigs, all sorts of jigs on the market. You know, there's all sorts of West Coast jig, mom and pop shops, you could say, you know, garage built jigs, all sorts. I start here because I love fishing a round rubber jig. As far as round rubber jig go, the round rubber is just essentially the jig skirt material. Why round rubber? For me personally, round rubber has more action than silicone, and it looks more natural than silicone. If I was to say slow down, and I was actually really slow down and drag a jig, in my confidence, I feel like round rubber will get more bites because it's more natural than silicone. Looking at silicone in water, silicone still flares. This is...
I don't know if you can see it.
It still flares. Sorry, I'm staring. I should probably switch over to StreamYard. But essentially, silicone still flares. But with silicone, it doesn't... If there's any kind of water movement with silicone, then it'll move. Whereas opposed to round rubber itself will undulate and it'll move even though there's very subtle water movement. And that's where round rubber shines over compared to silicone. If I'm flipping and pitching or skipping around docks and I'm just looking for a reaction bite, I'll just go silicone. Because silicone, day in and day out, it's easier for you to change your colors. It's easier to make the adjustments. Not that you need to change colors much. You know, a brown, a black, a brown purple, a brown green pumpkin, a brown black will get you through like 99% of your fishing, unless you're fishing like swim jig stuff. But in this scenario, we'll just say it's bottom contact stuff.
Yeah, and there's another great jig on the market. I mean, I love Bass Patrol. Don't get me wrong; they're definitely super affordable, and it's a good jig. But I gotta give a shout out where credit is due. The Dobbins Extreme Football Jig.
Yes,
that's another one. But that's again, you know what he's talking about with round rubber versus silicone. If you go to a Dobbins, or if you notice from any of the jigs that I have custom made for myself, I do what's called a blended skirt. So you can see there's black rubber, that's round rubber mixed in with silicone. And just like he's saying, that rubber, rubber for one is more neutrally buoyant, right? And some rubbers technically float. So even on a dead standstill, that rubber is trying to figure out how to float, or is so neutrally buoyant that it almost suspends where it was last left. Silicone sinks.
Yes.
So when you stop your jig with silicone, it'll just flatten to the bottom. It's not going to do its own thing. the rubber itself being neutrally buoyant, being elastic, it really kind of settles and does its own thing. Some of them will float, some of them will start to sink, some of them will stay neutrally buoyant. And it actually creates a much bigger profile on the bottom than if you were to just use silicone. So again,
Yeah,
that's why I
those.
like on my full size jigs, I love some rubber because it pushes that silicone out and makes that full profile much larger than if I had just put a ridiculous number of pieces of silicone in that jig.
Go ahead, Pua.
Are these are hybrids, huh? It's silicone mixed with rubber, isn't it?
Yep, that's
Yes.
Sled Dobbins. They're super cheap if
Yeah.
you buy them in the 3-pack. I think they're like
Yeah.
$9.99 for 3.
So-
It's one of the more affordable jigs on the market. Again, I like the original Extreme, which is a round bend 2/0 or 3/0 hook, if I remember correctly.
It's a
I
3.
don't like the EWG hook. I find that a lot of the times what happens is the fish will bite flat on the hook point and you'll just rip the jig out of their mouth.
Mhm.
It's better for me for largemouth specifically. But other than Mr. Max, we don't have a lot of dedicated largemouth fisheries. So,
Yeah.
But yeah,
So that brings up the next thing is for everybody that's listening out there, if you're gonna go buy a round rubber jig, it has to be hand tied. If they put a rubber band collar on it, don't even touch it because that rubber band collar doesn't squeeze down onto the round rubber itself enough to where it's gonna flare out. So it's just gonna look weird. It's just gonna look funky when you put it in the water. For round rubber, you have to have it hand tied.
really,
100%.
I mean, for me, the only time that I would ever even consider banded is for something like a swim jig where I don't want, 10, 15, 20 different swim jigs. I can buy 3 and then pull banded skirts off and put banded skirts on to change color. Now, do
Yeah.
I do that? Absolutely not, because those bands last about a month and then you have to replace the skirt and you end up spending more money than if you just got hand tied or wire tied. You can also do wire tied and get the same flare that he's talking about.
Yep.
But some sort of more permanent contact to the jig when you're talking live rubber. And then I know he's on here, Mr. Stephen Johnson. I have to give another shout out to another jig that's really affordable and really good, and that's the G Money, again, hybrid, like the Dobbins, where it has silicone and it has living rubber. And that's super, super important to me. And actually, when I said that I love the Kitech, a lot of the times I'll actually take the skirt off of the Kitech and retie it with fine silicone and fine rubber to get that exact action that Max is talking about.
It matters. It really does. That's just my opinion. Now, we could dive into this as well. I personally don't like a Dobbins jig. The only reason why I don't like the Dobbins jig is mainly in the weed guard. For me personally, the weed guard in a Dobbins jig is a little bit too stiff. Just me personally, because typically I would be fishing a football jig around rock or open water, and I just feel like it's a good weed guard. Don't get me wrong, it's a great weed guard. You could just trim it down, pluck a couple of strands out of it, and it's going to be lighter, and so it compresses easier. But for me personally, the Bass Patrol has the right amount of weed guard stiffness, if you want to call it, just for me. So, when I set it lay into the fish, I set the hooks, it works great for me. There's nothing wrong with the Dobbins football jig. It's just personal preference and how you fish it. So it's a very stout weed guard. It would definitely work better, say if you're fishing in, wood. Say if there's a lay down and you make 110 foot cast and you're dragging over the lay down, the Dobbins jig is more than likely not going to hang up versus, say, the Bass Patrol jig, just because that weed guard is a little bit stouter and it'll bump and it'll go off the weed, off the limbs much easier. So
I'm just going to call you out for being lazy.
yeah.
So would you guys? I guess this would be a question for the both of you. So
Hey, my lure maker friend is on. That's who I buy all these jigs from. He makes everything for me. Fucking awesome. Anyway, carry on.
There you guys go. Custom jigs right
hello.
there. Joseph gave his juice right there. Go
Yep,
ahead.
there it is.
He's gonna say no.
Do you guys think every brand makes a signature stiffness or lightness in the weed guards in terms of the number amounts of strands and the thickness of and the gauge of that of those guards?
Yeah. So
Yeah, absolutely. And
so since I used to, I'll cut you off here. Sorry, Joseph. Since I used to build them, you could buy the weed guard himself. Either, it comes in diameter size, so you can buy it as a thinner diameter with, fewer strands of the actual weed guard, or you could buy it in a thicker diameter with a more dense diameter of the weed guard material. So essentially, when it comes, it looks like I don't really have anything to show here, but it's like a
I've
bundle
got
of
it in
straws.
Yeah.
Imagine
Yeah.
like a bundle of straws. Essentially,
So-
the lighter ones would have less straws in them, and then the thicker one will have more straws in them. Is essentially what it works out to be.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to see, but when you talk about stiffness, right, and you look at let's see if you can see that because that one's clear. Do you see how thick that is?
Yeah.
And again, this has been trimmed, so you can see just how much of it I've cut off. But you step it down, so that's the large size. This is the medium sized. And then I don't have it here with me, but Kitech uses technically an extra fine, but there's also a fine size. Right, you can hardly even see the Kitech one. So
Even
each jig manufacturer kind of uses whatever they want, and you don't really get a say in it when you go buy a commercial jig. Dobyns uses the medium size, which is a really nice soft weed guard, but they do use a lot of it. So like the actual diameter of the insert of weed guard is a lot thicker than the Bass Patrol. The Bass Patrol uses about half as many fibers as the Dobyns. But what I like about the Dobyns is when I cut it at an angle, which you'll notice all of my jigs, I cut all the weed guards at an angle so that there's a bulk of them at the front and less of them at the back. That helps grass come over it. And then the other thing that I really do, and why I give the Dobyns credit, especially around rock, when you have extra fibers, you can fan them out like that, right? And what that does is as this comes over rock, as you can picture, that weed guard that's fanned off to the side stops the hook point from accidentally bearing into rock or a stump on the bottom or anything else. So I actually disagree with Max on the Dobyns jigs. I think it's one of the better ones, but it does take effort. Whereas the Bass Patrol, you can just pull out and fish and you'll be fine. The Dobyns you have to fan, and I like to cut because they come extra long for that. But the only ones that I ever fish straight out of the package, not doing anything, is Bass Patrol and Kitech. In fact, I almost wish the Kitech had twice as many as it does because it has a pretty wimpy, pathetic weed guard.
I think, me personally, I think the Kitech jig has the right amount, simply because it's a finesse jig, and you really, you're not supposed to be flipping, dualies with it.
Yeah.
No, but I would like, because they use 5 strands, right? That's like the signature, or 5 strands. I would like to see 10.
Yeah,
and
but that's
again,
essentially,
it goes to fanning it out and all of that.
That does bring up a good point, Abel. The new Kitech jig does indeed fix that issue. Yes,
the crawling one. Yeah, and that's a full-size football jig. And I haven't fished it yet, but I imagine it's probably just as good.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the Dobyns I like because you can fan it out and it really stops it from getting snagged.
We'll throw this one out there too. Metal weed guards. I'm not a fan of metal weed guards. And I'll tell you why. I've had metal weed guards. It could just be me, but I've had metal weed guards where they're too springy, So when I set the hook way out there and that fish comes up and it jumps, that weed guard springs back and it pushes against the hook. And so it can go both ways, as in it could pin the hook in the fish's mouth, as Poe likes, or it could push it completely out just because the springs on the metal weed guard pushes the hook out. But it depends. If it's a finesse jig, with a metal weed guard and that weed guard collapses, you can get away with it. But there's some metal weed guards out there that are extremely stiff, and it's like a bobby pin where you push it and
I
it's just gonna
noticed
bounce back
too
up.
is Jacob made me some flick shake hooks that had a wire weed guard in it, and again, the fiberglass is not very sharp. That's what this material is. It's like a fiberglass or something. Whereas metal, it tends to be quite sharp and firm, right? So when a fish bites down on it, it feels that in its mouth, especially if they're not tipped. The Picassos are tipped, so it's better than nothing. But if it's just a straight metal piece, that'll actually poke them in the mouth. So as soon as they bite it, they feel that and they let go. And a lot of times you don't have time to set the hook. And I've noticed that the 2 or 3 Picassos that I used, I felt the same thing, which is they go to bite down and that piece of metal is so stiff, it actually sticks them in the roof of their mouth a little bit. And as soon as they hit it, they drop it. Unless they're crushing it and swallowing it, then they don't have time to think about that. But if they're just biting it and they're going to suck it in a second time, 9 times out of 10, I find that they just drop it.
You like talking about sucking a lot, don't you?
Both ways, baby.
Yeah, both ways.
Hey, you guys remember those jigs from Newtek?
Yes, it had the really stiff weed guards. Yes.
It's kind of funny. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was my experience. That's why I was saying that exactly, because I fished those new tech jigs before. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah. I remember when those things came out, and I bought a bunch, like a newbie. I bought a bunch to try them. And every time I got bit, I could never pinfish. And I was always wondering why, man, how come I can't, I mean, it's such a, enormous bite, how come I'm not getting them? And then when I finally started playing around with the guard, it's like, Jesus, these things are so damn stiff. It was like, and what's even the point, right? There's, I mean, I'm not bashing on them, but it's just, from my experience, it's like they have those two, pendulums just pointing out, as weed guards, and it was like they hardly bent, and it was just like it was a real bad hookup ratio. But yeah, just wanted to know if you guys remembered about those.
Oh, I do. That's where my experience with those metal weed guard style of jigs came from. Was the new tech jigs? They don't get hung. They hardly get hung up. They hardly do. They could hardly land a fish from too. It was hard. I tried.
But yeah, elaborating on what Joseph was saying. I mean the jigs I use is the same thing. It's the weed guards are pretty stiff. I trim them down a little bit, and I flare them out. I keep flaring them out until they get to a point where it's just like, oh, okay, it looks like it's going to be able to penetrate through, but still have enough weed guard there to, come through wood and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, me personally, I don't trim the weed guard unless I'm fishing my own jigs that I still have some leftovers of, and those are just ball head jigs.
That's the first thing I do. It doesn't matter if I buy them custom from Jacob or if I buy Dobbins or if I buy any. The only jigs, like I said, that I don't trim are Kitex, honestly, because there's nothing to trim. You just can't trim that, even if you wanted to. And I'll even bump it one comment back to Steven. The little mini Ike jigs actually come with an optional weed guard. It's not that they fall out in the package. You're supposed to glue them in because, a lot of the finesse jigs on the market don't even come with a weed guard. right? Like the Machine is a good example. It's a great jig that doesn't even have one.
Nishini.
Is it Nishini?
Nishini.
Nishini doesn't have one. There's a couple others. Like even fishing a hula grub, I very rarely fish, a weed guard on that. But as far as micro jigs, I mean, there is an undeniable need for them certain times of the year for sure. I've caught giant bass on Tulloch on not the spin guard specifically, but the Ike's mini jig with a TRD craw trailer.
So in the micro jig category, I don't mess with micro jigs too much. Not saying there's not a time and place for them. There is a time and place for them. For example, this past weekend on Tulloch, there was micro crawdads. We're talking like, 2-inch crawdads. Yeah, like tiny. Yeah. So if you wanted to say emulate the forage, that would have been the time to do it. Because it was also a full moon. The crowds were probably molting. I'm sorry, not melting, molting. And yeah, they're melting in our pot, in a crawdad pot.
Yeah.
No. But there is a time and place for them, especially when there's that newer batch of crawdads that are just born, and not only that, but a small jig can also imitate a really small shad. So, for example, say like a crappie hair jig, that's a tiny bait fish imitator, or a crappie, micro jig. So it still works. It just, there's a time and a place for it.
I mean, you could fish it all the time and probably catch fish on it all the time. But if you're going to specifically target big fish with it, that's super situational. And really where I personally love the spin jig, as somebody who doesn't have forward-facing sonar and occasionally tries to dork around with mid-strolling, that jig specifically with the impacts, what's the one that's the pointed tail? Just like the impact, right? The Kitech Easy Shiner pointed tail that doesn't have a paddle tail. I think it's just the shad impact. But anyway, Kitech makes a flat-bodied, pin-tailed. I guess it's technically a weightless jerkbait or any of those types of mid-strolling baits, and I really like fishing it as a strolling swim jig. That micro swim jig is awesome.
Are you referring to this thing?
It's the shad impact.
That's a sexy impact. I'm pretty sure it's the shad impact.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go, right there. So yeah, I take one of those in like the 3-inch version, and I take the spin jig, and it's basically like a mini swim jig, like very miniature swim jig. But I stroll with it, and the skirting material fluffs and flares, and sometimes that's all it takes. Again, more for crappie because I can't, scan for bass as well as you guys can that have live scopes. But if I go throw that around a tree on Tulloch for some crappie, they go absolutely crazy for it.
Great. That being said, back on the topic of jigs. Round rubber. We're going to go back to round rubber here. There's three different sizes of round rubber. Typically, your Dobyns jigs, they use a fine round rubber. Your Bass Patrol uses a standard size round rubber. And then your mop jigs, your Buckeye big mop jigs use a big round rubber. So it's a large size round rubber. There's actually 3 different sizes of round rubber. The fine round rubber works better in a finesse application where you're trying to finesse fish because it's more subtle. It flares out more, but it's more subtle. It's softer. It's softer on the eyes, you could say.
Flares out less. Standard.
Sorry?
Flares out less.
Yes, it flares out less. It's more subtle.
It's more compact. It doesn't undulate as much. The really
Exactly.
big stuff is so buoyant that it really like that Buckeye
It blows
Lures
out.
jig is like the
Yeah.
full size of bluegill on the bottom.
It's a cloud.
practically.
Yep.
Yeah. We are talking about rubber sizes. Small, medium, and largest. But yes, that's where that goes. You got that. There is a mix. The biggest problem with round rubber is there's not enough color selections for round rubbers. So you can't make that perfect match of a jig that you would like. So if you wanted, say, like 3 strands of silver and then 100 strands of white plus a little bit of strands of chartreuse, you could get that in round rubber because it's simple. But say if you want really glittery, or say the barbed wire for that peanut butter and jelly kind of color, you can't get that in round rubber. Round rubber only comes in, I believe, like 8 colors, and they're all solid colors. Your chartreuse, whites, blacks, browns, purples, and green.
I mean the easiest way to say it is rubber is not translucent, right? And it takes on whatever color that you put to it. It's usually white to start with, and then they color off of it, or black. But it's always a solid matte color. There's no transparency. There's no suspended glitter. There's none of that. Because as soon as you do that, you make it weak. And again, like I said, rubber is naturally opaque, solid colored.
Mm-hmm.
But silicone, like you said, is clear. So the sky is the limit, and it's a pretty stretchy, strong material. So if you throw flake in it, you throw all sorts of stuff in it, it's not going to compromise it and just have it crack and fall off. Yep. But there's also flat rubber, which is before our time. But that is still something that people really love to fish. I personally have never used it.
I have, sir. And flat rubber, in my experience, flat rubber really shines, in my personal opinion, when you want a big profile, in my opinion. And as in, like, say a pitching jig where it's falling straight down and it's a really big profile, it flares out just because it falls flat and more straight versus as round rubber. I don't know why it is, but round rubber likes to drift, as in likes to drag, whereas a flat rubber will actually fall more streamlined down. So it's typically better as, in my opinion, as like a flipping jig or a pitching jig where you're fishing heavy cover.
See, I thought it would have been more ideal for like swim jigs or spinnerbait skirts and stuff like that, where you want that wavy flare pulsing.
So round rubber is better for, say, a swim jig because it pulsates more, whereas a flat rubber is more like a kick. So it's not really, a flat rubber doesn't really pulsate. Like, say if you're shaking your rod tip, it doesn't pulsate. It's more a dead action kick. So kind of like, imagine like a flat where it just kicks. That's kind of my word vocabulary is really limited today, but it just kicks. It's more subtle. There is a time and a place for it, and quite frankly, it is cheap. For anybody that makes jigs, is old flat rubber is much cheaper because everybody's moved on to silicones, just because of the sheer amount of color options in silicone. So. Kitech Micros.
What about
corrugated?
I think that's the textured skirt material.
Yes.
Where it's like ribbed skirting is what they call it.
Yeah. It's just texture. In my opinion, it's the thing with the corrugated skirts is it's trying to emulate that round rubber flare, as in it's designed so that it's supposed to flare. At least that's the thought process behind the corrugated skirt material.
I thought it was to push and move more water, because silicone doesn't matter what you do, you can't get it to flare because it's not neutrally buoyant and springy.
Yeah, that's what it is designed for. But I feel like the once you actually stop it, then it feels like it pulsates. It's trying to emulate round
Silicone will
rubber.
do the same thing for a second, but it usually collapses flat. And actually, like if you notice, if you kill like a swim jig, they'll either float up or they'll float down depending
Yeah.
on
Yep.
how slow you're reeling.
Yeah,
But
it's
round
supposed.
rubber
It
where
is
it's at.
supposed to help displace rubber, water, but I've never really found it to really displace water, in my opinion. It's more of that undulating feel, but then that's just me. Yeah, as in it feels more like a round rubber, but not quite like a round rubber. It kind of flails on itself,
Gotcha.
but it's just me. You know, certain skirts are designed for certain situations, but that's just what I found for me. I mean, if you really think about it, how many corrugated skirts are there out there in the market?
Like
Yeah.
next to nothing. I've seen it
Yeah.
becoming more and more popular on football jigs. Like again, I think I'm going to pick on the Nishini because I think they use the ribbed. Pretty certain they do. But again, it's just so that when you talk about water displacement, right? You want to talk about moving and disturbing water. So when you look at like Kitex ribbing, for example, that's meant to just disturb the water around the bait and make its presence more known just because it displaces and creates currents. That was my understanding of the ribbed as well. And that's why like the Nishini works so well for such a small profile is because it really does move a lot more water than, fine silicone skirt.
The ribbed. But like I said, it's really hard. Just in my opinion, round rubber has the same effect. Just my opinion.
And it has more secondary action, in my opinion.
Yeah. So is there a time and place for it? Most likely. There you go. Able of the juice. They also hold air and release air bubbles.
Rib
Let's
for
see
the
at the bottom.
masses pleasure.
But that's just my experience. I don't have much. I tried it once, and I just went back to round rubber.
I had
Just me.
one Nishini jig, and then it got snagged, and I haven't bought another one since.
So let's go on to the fun one, the hooks.
Oh God.
I feel like a hook is why everybody buys a jig, quite frankly, besides the line tie, the weed guard, everything else. It really boils down to the hook. Most guys pay for a hook. Most guys pay for an owner hook on their jig or a Gamakatsu hook on their jig or a Mustad, VMC hook. I think the real focus should be the hook gauge, as in how thick of the hook you're looking at and for what style of fishing you're trying to go with it. So what I mean by that is if you're fishing heavy cover, go with a heavier gauge of hook versus that if you're fishing more of an open water application, fishing a medium wire hook, say like a 2X, is going to probably be better served. Because if you have too big of a hook, all you're going to do is just blow a hole in the fish's mouth. And if it's way out there, it's going to shake your jig. Like, I've lost too many fish doing that. This is the best way to say it. Is if your hook gauge is way too big and you're fishing an open water jig, you're bound to lose fish. And that's just my opinion.
I honestly, I prefer a finer hook, but that's just me. Like Jacob will tell you, he likes a 2X hook in his jig. I've actually got it here. Again, this is his version of a Kitech jig. But he likes a 2X hook. I don't. I find that a standard 1X hook is way better for me than a 2X hook. So again, 1X would be more comparable to what's actually in the Kitech versus the 2X to the right. I don't know if you can quite see just how much thicker this one is over that one. And unless I am fishing, flipping pretty much exclusively, I honestly prefer those lighter wire hooks in almost all applications now. Not even just in jigs.
Quite frankly, most of our fishing out west here, you could get away with a 2X. A 2X is plenty strong for most of our fishing out here, unless you're punching the Delta or you're punching really thick stuff or flipping really thick stuff. A 2X will get it done on most of our lakes, especially our Highland reservoirs. In my opinion, I mean, a 2X Bass Patrol hook, which is just a Mustad 2X, I've pulled plenty of fish out of fairly heavy cover, So, your thoughts, Pua, on hooks?
I like them thick. I like them thick.
I was waiting for you.
Yeah. But that's true. To reiterate what you just said, I mean, I've lost a lot of fish in open water with that thicker gauge. They just have way more leverage to shake off when you're making those bomb casts and you're fighting them from a distance away. So what I do now with the thicker gauge hooks on the jigs is I try not to throw it too far, and once I get them hooked up, I horse them in. I mean, obviously you can't do that with a lighter wire. You don't want to do that because you might bend out the hook. But that's just what I do now. You got to play with the lighter wire stuff. That's just how it is,
Yeah, and that leads to this comment. It's the heavier wire hook. You really can't set it. If you're fishing a flipping jig or a 3X hook on say 10 pound. This example is 6 and 8, but on 10 pound, that hook is not going to penetrate. Yeah. The hook point is too sharp. The hook point is too dull. Just because the diameter of the hook is too thick, it will not penetrate. You'll break off before you get a hook through. Yeah.
Well, and that's again, a lot of our jig fishing, aside for when I'm fishing, like a giant full size profile, is very clear water, pretty moody fish. So I fish a lot of 10 to 12 pound on those Keitech jigs. And I know you guys are going to look at me like I'm crazy for that, but I have noticed a significant increase in bites on 10 pound over 15, 17, 20 that most people would throw a jig on, especially in the winter when it's cold and you're slow jagging it. That's the only time that I ever, typically I don't do 10 unless I absolutely have to, and that's mostly a lake party thing. But 12 pound test for those finesse jigs is pretty standard for me. And you're not going to get a good hook set if you're using 12 pound tests on, say, the Archie Buckeyes jig. There ain't no way that I'm setting the hook on 12 pound with that jig.
What's up, Anthony?
Ants.
Popping in. Yeah, I don't change my line for jig fishing. It's either 15, 17, or 20 for me. Even on a Keitech jig, I'll fish 15. I never drop it down to 10 or 12. I just don't find the need for it, me personally. If I was to drop it down to 15 or say 12, below 12, the only reason why I would drop down to 12 is if I'm fishing, say, a ball head jig. And the only reason why I would do that is because I want it to be, when I'm fishing a ball head jig, I'm more targeting stuff that I see visibly on, say, bluff walls. And on that 12 pound, there's not that much drag. So I can get it so it falls straight down. So that's the only time I would actually go to a lighter line if I'm trying to staircase it on a really steep drop to get it to stay in the strike zone for as long as possible because I could drag it much slower and it would just barely fall off. Or say when it falls as it pendulums, it'll fall straighter versus as on 20 pound, your 20 pound is going to want to pull that bait back towards you just because the line is so heavy. So that's the only time I would actually downsize online is if I want to keep that bait pinned against the wall more so. But
I like it for the same reason that it stays down, so you can fish a lighter jig in deeper water. So a lot of the times you'll notice for me with a Kitech jig, even if I'm fishing 40 feet of water, I'm still using a 3/8 with 12 pound. Whereas you would have to, you'd have to step up to a half or 3/4 like Max does with heavier line. And then the other thing I like about it is, the small profile jigs move a lot more than say your full profile, right? So when you bump into something with a full profile, it kind of smashes into it and then works its way up and over. But if I hit that Kitech jig into something, it'll deflect side to side and roll on itself and have a bunch of secondary action that might be hindered if you use heavier line. And that goes both ways, right? I do fish a Kitech jig on 15-pound test when I know I'm fishing nasty, chunky, disgusting stuff because I don't want that jig to sway and turn. I want it to stay pretty perfect and vertical so that as I'm lifting it up and over rocks, it doesn't fall into a crack and get stuck. And there goes my $6 jig. But on the flip side, if I'm fishing relatively open, small chunk rock, I want that small, little, tiny pebble rock to smack into my jig and have it sway side to side and roll all over itself, which it can do much easier with finer line than it can on thicker line.
yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Even during the winter, as Jacob, right?
Yeah.
As Jacob says, lighter line for the winter because you got to slow down more. It makes a lot of sense. On my home pond, it could just be because it's largemouth. I don't have any issues. As in, I fish the same line class year round.
Yeah, but I've never seen Eastman clear.
It's clear. Trust me, it's clear.
Clear is relative, okay? Is it Tulloch clear? Is it Pardee
It's-
clear? Is it Folsom clear?
It's 7 foot plus clear.
Okay, that's not clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To me, that's
not
clear. Okay.
water.
That's pretty
To me,
clear
that's
for
really
Eastman.
Yeah.
That's clear
To
for
me,
your
that's
home
clear.
pond, but that's not clear. Like you go to
Yeah.
Pardee, right, and the color lines in 35 feet of water.
Yeah.
That's a different level. Yeah, is it
Yeah, it's
Mojave
not-
clear? He's
it's not
probably
Mojave
talking the
clear
same
either.
thing I'm talking right now. 35
Yeah.
foot color line. You can count boulders in 45 feet of water just looking down.
It's not that clear.
So,
So-
that's more of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So it could be more so of my fishery is not set up for it. But, that's just my experience. Then again, I like my visibility, as in my 6 feet of visibility. I don't like more than that. That's way too much for me.
That's fun. That's when you can catch dumb
Yeah.
fish. I like that a lot. When you start
Yeah.
going to there's a couple of lakes up above Folsom going up towards Tahoe where 40 foot of viz is no problem. There were a couple of times that I was sitting on rocks that I thought were in 15 or 20 feet with a 1/8 shaky head. And I went to go drop it down on a fish that I saw and I was like, damn, how far down is that fish? I wasn't even looking at my graph or anything. I was just looking at the fish below me and I was in 53 feet of water.
Jesus.
That's
I'm
pretty
not
dangerous.
jealous. Yeah, I'm not jealous. Not at all. That's probably why Tulloch was so tough. Anyways.
Much better fishery when it's cloudy and disgusting.
Yeah. Rods. Setup. Rods, reels. We already talked about line. Rods and reels. What are your guys' go-to jig rod for day in and day out? If you have one rod to land every single fish that you could ever land on a jig. Anybody want to take it?
I'll go real quick. 7'3" medium heavy.
What action? Fast action?
Fast, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I run Sniper Smith. Maybe Sweeper. I kind of bounce around depending on what I'm doing. I really like for short casts, close quarter fishing. I like a 7'3" heavy, fast or extra fast.
Mhm.
I don't really go much shorter than that. I do have a 7-foot mag heavy that I will for like specifically Clear Lake and literally nowhere else use it. But 7'3" heavy fast action is about what I use the majority of the time. And then when we go to all these open water lakes, I jump up to a 7'6" medium heavy fast because I want the extra casting distance. I want to be casting that jig a country mile. And I'm not worried about trees over my head or anything when you're in the middle of the lake. So
Well, if everybody's watched me for a long time, I will always preach the 7'6" medium heavy, moderate fast X Sprite. Always. Biggest reason is it's a parabolic jig rod, as in the whole entire rod loads. And there is backbone to it at the butt end. Well, not really butt end, but there is backbone to the rod. But essentially, more than 3/4 of the rod loads. And I've lost count of how many fish that I have not lost on that rod that I should have lost. Where I set the hook and the rod's way back here and there's slack all throughout my line. But because my rod tip is still kind of loaded all the way back here, I can really still reel in and catch up to those fish. And I'm for sure, if anybody's seen any of my clips, you've seen it where I've set the hook and my rod's all the way back here, and for whatever reason that fish doesn't come off when it should have come off. So that's why I like that rod so much.
see, I don't like a moderate fast because I feel like you lose tip sensitivity. That's why I like a fast or an extra fast, is because I feel like I am way more. And again, it's more for when you're getting bites on the fall, right? When you come up over a ledge and drop it down.
Anthony, I'm assuming you're trying to sell rods here, rods here.
He's making fun of all the Kitech guys from earlier.
Oh, gotcha. That's fun. Yes, so the moderate fast you do lose a lot of tip sensitivity, as it is not the most sensitive rod. It really isn't. But typically, when you feel a jig bite, they thump it, you will typically feel it, and that's why.
What do you do when it's a mushy bite?
When it's a mushy bite, you'll feel the rod load. And typically, as in, what I mean by that is because the rod is a softer tip action. If it's a mushy bite, the rod will just load. As in, there's a certain point where it just loads, and it's not just bottom contact. And that's why, it's, for me, the best rod.
Interesting.
Yeah. Gear ratio. Something that I feel is not talked about in jig fishing much. 8
High gear for me.
8.
I
7 for me.
like just a standard 7. I feel like, and again, we shouldn't really be talking gear ratio because it means nothing.
Well,
because every gear ratio is different for each reel. Like, there's not going to be a 7 gear ratio for Shimano that's the same as a Dio, which is the same as a It's all tied to the mechanical advantage. If you want to talk speed, right, you should say high speed, standard speed, low speed, that type of stuff.
So I like a 6.
So that would be standard gear.
Yeah, and
and I like high speed reels. We don't like the extra fast reels, right? Like your 8+.
Yeah.
But
XPs,
I like that, like 7 1-to-1 Daiwa, 30-ish IPT.
So the reason why I like a 6, and it goes into the rod because it's essentially a full setup. I can keep them pinned, and all I do is I just reel. So that's why I like a 6, because a low speed is a more torquey reel, if you want to call it that, as in it just has more power to it. Not saying a 7 doesn't. A 7 definitely has more than enough power to it. Where most of the time we're catching, a 2-pound bass or say a 5-pound bass. That's like 80% of the fish you're going to catch probably on any given day of bass fishing, right? So a 7 is plenty. I like a 6 because with the way that I have the rod set up, I can just lean into them and just continue to reel, and I don't ever have to lean down to give the fish any kind of slack, to pick up any kind of slack. I just whack them, and I just keep reeling until they're at the boat, and that's why I like a 6.
I don't like the really fast reels because I feel like people tend to unintentionally fish faster than they mean to because they take up so much line with each hand turn. Right.
Yeah.
When you start jumping up into those 8-to-1 gear ratios or 10-to-1s or whatever, when you turn that handle once, it's almost 50% more line than, your standard 7-gear ratio. You're a fast reel, but not, extra fast, or I forget what they call the super high speed ones.
We should charge Anthony for running ads for Copper State Tackle.
At least give us free stuff. I mean, we can give it back away and get more people interested. Like Robert probably fell asleep by now.
Yeah, we'll run ads for you, Anthony, if you just give us some sort of discount or something. Push more people towards Copper State Tackle. G Team. Just saying. Yeah. But a 7 gets it done. 7 is kind of all around. Flipping pitching, I still stick with a 6. Just because I like to winch them out. I just set the hook. And typically, if it's a line burner, and what I mean by a line burner is when they eats it and just takes straight off, I let the rod handle that. I catch up on a 6, but that's just me.
I do like the I guess standard reel speed, which I guess for if it's 100 to size spool or 150 it changes, but that like 26 to 28 ish IPT, I really like that for a swim jig when I do fish a swim jig, and I know that Pua is probably a better one to ask for that, and I'm assuming the answer is I don't change anything, I just fish it on the same rod, but I like that slower average speed for swim jigs because a lot of the times I'm not burning a swim jig. When I fish a swim jig or like a swim jig, it's because I can't get them on the vibration of a chatterbait because it's just not quite warm enough. They're not quite active enough or whatever. So I tend to like slower roll that swim jig through the grass rather than, burn it over the top or something like that.
So I have a question for both of you guys. Swim jig fishing. Do you guys find that a stouter hook is better, or do you find that a thinner wire hook is better on a swim jig? The hook diameter, because it kind of goes. If the hook diameter is too thin, you can't burn them in. If it's too thick, you're gonna lose fish.
I find that I get way more hookups and a way better hook placement with a finer hook than when I have a thicker hook, because when they hit it hard and they're moving fast, and it's a reaction strike, right, with a single hook and not a treble hook. So I find that, like the Strike King is one that I've used in the past that I absolutely hate because it's just such a thick hook. And I feel like that gaff is like near impossible to successfully penetrate or do anything worthwhile other than get smacked and then make you feel like you suck. But I definitely like your standard 2x hook. And even when I'm fishing straight braid, I still like a 2x hook because it's so hard to straighten out a hook on a bass. It really is. You have to try hard to do it. And, unless you're fishing close quarters or you have like fluke, wrapped around something and you're pulling ridiculously hard, I very rarely straighten out a hook.
The same for me. I only ask that because I've experienced bad experiences with if you want to call it a striking, heavy hook. I know there's a time and a place for it. I get it. Especially if you're on a boat and you can just flip them into the boat. It works.
Yeah, but that's 100% different. Like the no jack is another good example.
Yeah.
Like if I were fishing straight braid, a 765 mag heavy rod, and I had the ability to pull the fish to me and not me to the fish, I would 1,000% be fine with that. But when you're in a kayak and you rip and stick a fish, it doesn't matter how big you are, how much you weigh, your kayak is just going to pull to the fish. And that's also another weird thing with jig fishing that really takes you a long time to get used to is you gotta step on a hook set. Like it's not the same as bank fishing. It's not the same as fishing off a boat. Like when you watch Max set the hook on a jig, you can hear that rod whoosh.
It's great. I know everybody enjoys it. It's great.
But that's something that you absolutely have to do in a kayak, and I still even do on 10-pound test with a Kitech jig.
Yeah.
Because I know when I set the hook, as soon as I make contact with that fish, even if I'm on spot lock or anything, my kayak will move a foot or two towards the fish and cushion the blow.
Yeah.
And I find it near impossible with those heavy gauge hooks. That's why I don't like them. I just won't use them.
I mean, if you just paid attention to anybody that kayak fishes and you watch their video clips when they get onto a better fish, like a 3-pound plus fish, you'll see the kayak just start moving as soon as they set their hook or they lay into them. That's just
all the
that's
time.
part of kayak fishing. Yeah,
punching. Oh my god, man! I got to punch out of a boat a couple of times, and I just couldn't believe how different the mechanics of punching out of a boat are versus punching out of a kayak.
Yeah.
Like you've got 5 seconds really punching on a kayak for go or no go as to whether or not you're going to land that fish. And you got to be on it. Whereas on a boat, you got so much time to screw up and you still have so much leverage over the fish to get him up and out of those weeds. You got to put the gas to him on a kayak.
And speaking of which, going back to gear ratio reels, I'm starting to find this year that those extra high speed ones, those like 8 and ups, I'm starting to not really feel that on punching because it's like what you were saying, Max. It's like, I can reel in more line, but dude, when you need to fight these fish that are digging into the dirty stuff, it's really hard to torque them out of there with the 8 gears and it's just, it doesn't work, Yeah.
You don't have enough power in the reel itself.
No. Mechanical advantage is what it is, right? So when you think of multiple pulleys and stuff, if I try and deadlift 1,000 pounds, I can't do it. But if you give me 8 pulleys, I could pull it up, no problem. I'm sure it's going to move like an inch, but the amount of force versus the amount of input force versus output force is way different. Like for me with punching, I still use a 7. I like the 7.3, but I use an oversized handle and a 150 spool or a 200 spool, so that even though it's technically a faster reel, it's not necessarily in the gearing that makes it faster. It's just the spool diameter that makes it faster.
Yeah.
So like my favorite punching reel is a 200 6.3 because that's just as fast as an 8-1-1, but it's got the mechanical advantage of a 6.3 to 1.
Yeah, that is why some guys still continue to punch with a 200 size reel or even a 300 size reel. There's some guys that punch with a 300 size reel.
That's too much.
Yeah, there's not many, but I'm just saying there are guys out there punching with 300 size reel for the mechanical advantage.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've noticed that, and that's why when I jig fish, I go for 6. Because
Yeah,
every
you
time I
also catch like 14-pound fish. So,
well, that's why I
Yeah.
go for 6. Yeah, that's why I go for 6 though. Is if I'm aiming for that one bite, that one big bite, that one 5+ pounder bite, I want to land it. And the way that I found to land them most successfully is have a reel that can actually torque on them. Yeah, gets them to jump less. And not only do you, I've had 8-pounders where I've set the hook on a jig and I just reeled and they just come up with their mouth open. I've had 8-pounders do that from a 6-gear ratio reel or low speed reel, standard speed reel. So I've done it before and I'll continue to do it because it works.
Power over speed.
Yeah. So that's just, it gives them no time to do anything else because they can't do anything else. So that's why I prefer it that way. But
Interesting.
yeah. Anything else you guys got?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit still again to swim jigs because I feel like that's kind of a less talked about jig category. I mean, we talk about bladed jigs a lot, and Pua is kind of the master of that. So, don't need to talk about that. But, I feel like that's a bait that on the West Coast, especially, kind of gets overlooked. I mean, I don't know how many people here actually go and pick up a swim jig very often. I know I'm not the best at it, but I will say that open water tactics, especially with some of those new finesse swim jigs that are coming out, that's like one of my best producers. A micro 3/16 ounce swim jig with a 3.3 or 2.8 inch fat on it. I've had an absolute blast with that. Shout out to Jacob for sending me one just to try. But that's been something that's been super successful for me. And then more this year, mostly because of Pua, I started picking up the swim jig out on the Delta, and where I was struggling to catch fish on a chatterbait, I was really starting to pick up fish on that like 4.3 fat mixed with, a swim jig and a bluegill color. It's amazing how different that bait is. And again, I don't know if you want to give some juice for what you like to use, but I pretty much exclusively use the ones that Jacob makes for me. But I do have a couple of the dirty jigs, and I really like them a lot.
That's all I use, the dirty jigs. Yeah.
And then the other one that I was thoroughly impressed with, and I still really love, is the 6th swim jigs. I've had a lot of really good luck with those. I feel like the quality is up there with dirty jigs as well. And they do make a finesse one.
Hi, Taz. We got everybody in here. Jesus.
I know, we got loaded tonight.
Yeah.
Whole crowd.
I just, talking about swim jigs, I just seen this. It's an interesting jig. Recess line tie, technically. It's a 5/0 though, which is also interesting.
That's a stout
It
one.
looks like it's an EWG swinging.
This, no.
It looks, oh, never mind. You got to go to the white so you can actually see the hook profile.
No, this is not a, it's not a
Oh, no.
swing
It's
lock
just
or swing. Yeah.
giant,
It's just a 5/0.
giant hook.
That is an interesting swim jig to me. Not that I swim jig fish much.
Yeah, I really like the 6th more so, and the same with the dirty jigs because it doesn't quite have, an inline line tie like, say, for example, the Berkeley jigs or any of the other ones. Find that it does come up and over grass really well. The colors for the 6th are like almost as good as the dirty jigs. Both of them are really good, and it's got a stout enough hook and not too stout So I that's pretty much, if I had to go commercial, that's what I would get. Otherwise, I would just stick to the poison jigs, which you can also buy a version of on Tackle. I think it's Longinus or something makes them with the poison head from. But anyway,
Magical jig from Tulip. You know, to be fair with you, Kyle. Sorry.
Bass Pro. You already showed it. Bass Patrol.
Yeah, Bass Patrol. Quite frankly, it is a Bass Patrol jig. Good
Make
lord,
want
you
to
guys
see
are all
the whole
jumping.
setup.
It's just a Bass Patrol jig. Fun fact for you, Kyle. A lot of guys on the elites are doing the exact same thing, fishing a jig that exact same way. Live scope fishing for jig, how you saw me sitting there fishing, and they do the exact same thing: a 3/4 ounce jig with a flapping hog. Why a flapping hog? Because it doesn't kick. It's easier to control the jig to fall right in front of them and place it right in front of the fish when you're live scope jig fishing. It just makes it easier so it doesn't pendulum away from the fish. So, and then the 3/4 helps get that reaction strike as well. So that's really it. Besides that, you just gotta go make enough casts at them until they bite. That is live scope fishing in a nutshell. You go make casts at enough fish that you visibly see on live scope until they bite. That's all it is. In my opinion. I mean, Sean is here. What do you say, Sean? Do you think that's true, Sean? Drop it in the comments. I know you're here, Sean.
Come on, live scope juice.
Yeah. He missed it. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that, Sean. But okay. So the question for you, Sean, is: do you believe that live scope fishing is essentially?
I agree.
Oh dear. Oh dear. You're great, Sean. But yes, that's really all we kind of got for tonight. I mean, swim jigs typically have a 0 degree line tie, 0 degree to 15-degree line tie. It's more straight. Football jigs typically have a more 90-degree line tie. Arky style jigs are 15 to 30-degree line tie. Yeah, it's just the reason why the line tie is where the line tie is at is so it comes over cover. You know, and depending on what kind of structure you're fishing.
Anything for $20.
What about hair jigs? Do you want to dive into hair jigs, gentlemen?
I mean,
Well,
we can, but
I'm not good with hair jigs.
I love a marabou jig. I fish the crap out of a marabou jig, but I don't touch the bucktail, big, preacher jigs.
Preacher jigs.
He does. I have not fished those, but I will fish a marabou jig until my arm falls off. Absolutely love fishing marabou jig.
How do you fish a marabou jig, Joseph?
Slow, and slow.
Just reeling it,
mid-strolling it. It depends on what I tie it in, but the heaviest I tie it is a 5/30 seconds. I don't tie anything heavier than that. Typically, I'm fishing it on either a 3/30 seconds or 1/8 head. And I tie a very full profile marabou jig, specifically because when marabou gets wet, it holds a lot of water. So it casts decently well. Not going to say it casts well, but it casts better than you would think a 3/30 second or a 1/8 head would. The way that I really like to fish it is a lot like a mid-stroll, but specifically around grass. So instead of, you're not going to find anything like what I fish.
No. I know,
but
it's just so people know.
You know what a marabou jig is and stuff. These are more for like what you would want to fish for a float and fly style of head and profile. I take the VMC Moon Eyes. There's another mold very similar to that you can get. And I tie my marabou jigs to be about 2.5 to 3.5 inches long and very full, so that when they're in the water, they really flare out and it slows the fall a lot. But I'm just slow rolling and twitching a lot like mid strolling, except less twitching and more slow rolling. So you're kind of cruising it around weed edges. You're kind of killing it in pockets. Another place that it works really, really well that not a lot of people think is around docks. So especially docks that have toolies, because a lot of the times when I fish a hair jig, I'm specifically trying to fish it as a leech. So I really like it to be that slow, undulating, natural motion of marabou. And it doesn't always catch big fish. I'm not going to say it's like a big fish crusher, but when the bite is really tough, it catches the crap out of fish all the time.
I fish my preacher jig, but it's a very situational deal. As in, we don't have too many current ledge driven systems out here. I mean, Toluk might be the only one I could actually think of, because Toluk has current running through it when they let water go. Plus, they do have ledges on Toluk, but most of the time it's not really, quite frankly, shallow enough to fish those ledges on Toluk. Those ledges on Toluk are way too deep, and once it's winter pool, there's no fish on those ledges to be caught on a preacher jig, because the preacher jig is more so of a summer bait. When I fish my preacher jig, it's more so when the fish are suspending off of points for me, and it's a very situational thing. I can't even give you guys the last time I caught a preacher hair jig fish out here. It's just been a very funky year for me with that lure. But all I do is, it's the same thing as my OV500. I throw it out there and I yo-yo it. That's all it is. But I yo-yo it with the reel instead of the rod for me on a preacher jig.
So you're burning it and killing it.
Yeah, I'm burning it and killing it. But it gives a similar effect. Lifting the rod tip makes it kind of shoot up straight more, whereas reeling it kind of comes more like an arc for me. Yeah. So it's not so much a straight up and then straight down. It's more of an arc rise when you do a real retrieve, a real burn.
Yeah, and to answer Romel's question about rabbit fur jigs, I'm not even sure if you can buy them. It'd probably be something you'd have to tie yourself. Rabbit and marabou have very, very similar actions in the water. You're probably not going to get much difference out of it. Where I really, really like rabbit fur, and again, probably should just keep my mouth shut at this point, but I will tie micro finesse Kitech jigs with all rabbit. So I'll have 2 rabbit claws coming off of it, and then I wrap rabbit fur around the whole body, and that's the jig that I fish. No trailer, no nothing. The jig is tied in itself. And that's my favorite way to use rabbit, because rabbit's just more durable than marabou. A fish is not going to tear out rabbit fur, whereas it will tear out ostrich.
I don't fish for anything furry, so I wouldn't know. But that's a different story. Fat fly, a Spro flat fly is also a great alternative as a shad imitator when the bait is small. In the hair jig grand scheme of things, especially when the water's cold, like a float and fly deal, but you could really take it and stroll it a lot. It's the same thing. I think where hair style of jigs excel, say, like a crappie jig, a plastic crappie jig, or say like a mid-strolling bait, like say a Sakamata shad. I think hair really excels when it's colder, when it's slick, calm, and there's high suns, is where I feel like hair jig excels more. And obviously pressure. Pressure always Pressure always makes hair jigs excel a little bit more because it's different. Not too many guys throw hair jig, so it's more natural.
Interesting.
What about
There's
you, Pua?
there's a rabbit hair jig, in case you're wondering. It's called Rabid Baits hair jig. I didn't even know they made it, but be micro.
I
Sorry.
use
Carry on.
bucktails sometimes for stripers. That's it. But for bass fishing, I mean, I've tried it before. You know, your standard like hair jigs.
Is it
But then
is it really a chatterbait in 40 foot, or is it a hair jig in 40 foot? Which is it?
it's a chatterbait. I wouldn't throw a hair jig, even if I knew how.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I just throw them for stripers when I get a chance. I mean, I don't know. I've tried it for bass and I haven't had any luck on them.
Yeah. Buffalo and fly, which is a good deal. You know, winter time is coming up. Bow and fly, hair jigs. Jigs in general in the winter is really the best time to learn how to fish a jig, in my opinion. And then it just goes. Once you figure out how to catch them during the winter on a jig, once you go beyond that and it warms up into the spring, the bite just gets better. You know, you don't drag it as slow, you drag it faster. It's more reactionary. It just gets better. So, but that's jig fishing. Anything else you guys like to add?
Yeah, don't go out and buy a bunch of different colors. Keep it simple and standard.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. You know, like we've shown you a lot, and there are certain areas that are niche for sure. Like, you know, when you go to the Delta or Clear Lake or any of those places that have swamp craws, red is definitely something that does play a factor. But majority of my jigs, you know, some form of black, some form of brown. I don't really mess with it that much.
I'm a crawdad now.
That was the whole goal. We're gonna end this at the end. Yeah, but browns, purples, green pumpkins.
Yeah, and even when I fish a swim jig, right, I'm not like trying to color match my Kitech and all that. Like, majority of my swim jigs are a clear, glassy minnow color of some sort, so like electric shad or shad-like, and bluegill. I don't really dabble much outside of that. I don't even have a black and blue swim jig. I just have bluegill and shad forage. Football jigs, you know, blacks and browns. I mean, you don't have to make it super complicated. Even when I fish a marabou jig, the color I fish the most is called cinnamon. It's like a fiery brown.
Fun fact for you: if you ever get the chance and you find a pack of Zoom twin tail, Fatbird twin tails in the cinnamon color, it matches your browns better than the Yamamoto browns. Fun fact for you guys.
I mean,
So
that's
it
also
looks-
true. The Bass Pro Shops brand twin tails, in case you were wondering.
So there's even within the plastics, there's a certain color where it looks like a more natural brown, if you want to call it that. But that's to our visible eyes. It doesn't mean it really matters, quite frankly.
I've actually found that more and more now I'm switching to the Bass Pro Shops twin tail grub, believe it or not. I like the Yamamotos a lot. They're really soft. They kind of get destroyed pretty easily. But the Bass Pro Shops have the same size twin tails as the 5-inch Yamamoto, but the actual body of it is smaller. So if I
Are you
really
just
want to fish a Kitech jig and keep it small profile, I prefer the Bass Pro Shops, to be honest with you.
Are you just upset that GSM is buying everybody, so you're just revolting, and now you're going to Bass Pro Shops?
No, you mean you can even ask Elton. I took him out fishing, and he was fishing a Kitech jig with Yamamoto twin tails because that's all he had. And I was like absolutely whooping him on the Bass Pro Shops because the main body of the twin tail grub on the Bass Pro Shops is pretty thick. You know, it's like the size of a Senko or anything else. Not the Bass Pro Shops. I meant the Yamamoto. The Bass Pro Shops is tiny. I mean, it's got big, huge claws like the 5-inch, but the actual meat of the bait is tiny, like half the size of a 5-inch.
I don't go that deep into it.
Hey,
That's
I mean,
too
I was
deep.
catching fish left, right, and center. He wasn't.
Yeah, I don't go that deep into the thick of it.
But no, I'm not mad about GSM at all. I just, yeah, I was at Bass Pro Shops and I didn't have any more cinnamon purple flake. And Bass Pro Shops was sold out of Yamamoto, so I bought their brand and I bought like 3 packs of them, and I actually ended up liking them.
Well, that's good to know. Maybe this winter when you come down, you'll bring some and we'll fish it. When you come down, I'll put you on some fish. How about that? Some
It's
jig
always
fish.
a promise, but usually I'm the one that puts you on fish.
Yeah, that's a good thing. That means I'm learning from you, and you're not learning from me. That means you're a better angler than
Yeah.
I
No, I'm just messing with you.
am.
There is one other jig that I hate talking about this, but I will talk about it since you brought up GSM. It's not a jig, but it is a jig. And I hate myself for telling you all of this, but the heavy weighted poop bait category of soft plastics is kind of one that has exploded. I know GSM just launched the Nuki Bug, I think they call it. And previously there was the Yamatanuki or the Depths Cover Scat or any of the other 5 million ones that are on the market. But what a lot of people don't think about doing is actually fishing them as a jig, because they are, 5/8 of an ounce to up almost a couple of them are like an ounce and a half, I think is the big size depths. I like to take a punch skirt and I peg a punch skirt around those heavyweight soft plastics and I drag them just like a jig. And I'll tell you why I do it, because there are areas where I want to fish a jig that I just can't. When you start looking at big
Rip
talus, chunk rock, rip wrap that you would normally want to crank over or do anything else over, if you throw a football jig in that, you're almost guaranteed to lose it. If you throw a ball head jig in that, you're almost guaranteed to lose it. If you throw a ball head jig in that or an arky or any style of jig where you have a lead head, as soon as it comes up over that rip wrap and falls, it's stuck and it's lost for good. And you'll donate a lot of jigs doing that. But if you take a heavyweight soft plastic instead, it doesn't have the tendency to want to fall headfirst into a crack or anything. And a lot of times you can crawl up and over stuff that you wouldn't normally. But I'm not going to go answer questions on that. That is the only pro tip you get.
Essentially, all he said was he took a punch skirt, he took an EWG hook, and he put one of those poop baits, and he pegged the skirt to the hook with no weight. So it's not even a punch rig. It's just a weightless punch skirt with a poop bait of some nature. Or even a crawl bait if you want to, but that's kind of light. But essentially, that's just what it
Well, the
was.
Nuki Bug is a craw bait. So it's a heavyweight scat style bait that has claws on it. So it's effectively fishing a jig 100% without lead weight.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a time and a place for that as well. And I would still call that jig fishing because you are fishing it like a jig. Joseph and Peggy.
Oh dear, you're
It's
great.
getting late. We got to call it soon.
Yeah, we should probably call it on the pegging, so we go do some
Yeah.
pegging of our own.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the only other jig that I ever really fished that not a lot of people think of it as a jig. They think of it as, a fast falling soft plastic bait. But where it does really shine is that rip wrap area where you can't normally fish any other type of jig because you're just expected to lose it.
It's also a great bluegill imitator. I fished it, and it is a great bluegill imitator. So, for anybody that's wondering out there, there's always a lot of bluegill on riprap. Just saying. Always. And with that, I think we should just end it because that's way too much. Too much pegging. I think we should end it.
Overload.
Yeah. All right, everyone.
Well, thank
Good
you
night.
all.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate the large turnout tonight. No